I love Star Wars. I've probably spent like 1,000 hours of my life watching, reading, playing, or thinking about stories from the galaxy far, far away. Is that embarrassing to admit? Maybe a little bit, but everyone likes Star Wars. It's one of the most popular franchises ever made. Unfortunately, that means that a lot of assholes like Star Wars. A huge part of the fanbase are conservatives, or maybe even worse, people who think that the series shouldn't have politics forced into it. But Star Wars has always been political. I mean, hear it from George Lucas himself. Quote, "My focus is social systems. In science fiction, you've got two branches. One is science, and the other is social. I'm much more of the 1984 kind of guy than I am the spaceship guy." From day one, Star Wars wasn't just a thrilling science fantasy adventure. It was also leftist political commentary. Part 1, the original trilogy. I'm guessing pretty much everybody has figured out that the Empire is inspired by Nazi-era Germany. Imperial officers' uniforms are modeled after Nazi uniforms, and the word stormtrooper is just taken directly from the term for the Nazi paramilitary. The original trilogy is basically just about killing Nazis. The rebels have no remorse about gunning down members of the Empire. Stormtroopers are shot and Death Stars are destroyed without a moment of hesitation. Sure, Luke gives Vader a second chance in Return of the Jedi, but in situations where this isn't an option, Star Wars explicitly and unwaveringly paints the rebels, the anti-fascists, as heroes. But most right-wingers think of themselves as anti-fascist, even though they hate that particular word for some unexplained reason. So how is Star Wars left-wing, and not just anti-authoritarian? Well, the Empire is also inspired by American imperialism, especially during the Vietnam War. George Lucas has been pretty clear about this, like in his interview for James Cameron's Story of Science Fiction. Lucas and Cameron are kind of all over the place in this interview, so here are a couple of the important bits. You did something very interesting with Star Wars, if you think about it. The good guys are the rebels. They're using asymmetric warfare against a highly organized empire. I think we call those guys terrorists today. Lucas interjects, "When I did it, they were Viet Cong. Were you thinking of that at the time?" And before he can even finish the question, Lucas answers, "Yes." Lucas goes on to reference the American Revolutionary War and then says, quote, "It was the same thing with the Vietnamese. The irony of that one is the little guys won, and the big, highly technical empire, the English Empire, the American Empire, lost. That was the whole point." I highly recommend you check out the rest of this interview if you've never seen it. There are lots of other great quotes from Lucas that I just didn't have a chance to mention here in the video. So, for people who are a little less familiar with the Vietnam War, here's a quick but a bit oversimplified recap, just so that you can see some of the similarities. After hundreds of years of French colonization, communist revolutionaries in Vietnam fought back against French rule and made a new government in North Vietnam in 1945. But France still controlled the government of South Vietnam until 1954, when fighting the rebels had become too costly, so they signed a treaty and left the region. But France giving up meant bad things for the US government. Without French support, the unpopular South Vietnamese government wouldn't last much longer, and Vietnam would become a united communist nation, spreading socialist ideals through the region and allying with American enemies like the Soviet Union. So the US decided to step in to be the new puppeteers. The CIA trained and gave military equipment to the South Vietnamese military, who arrested, killed, or tortured around 100,000 people that they accused of being communist sympathizers. But rebels in the region just kept fighting for freedom, so the US government sent more and more troops and funding over the years to help the Southern regime keep power, until eventually sending a full-scale invasion starting in 1964. But after 20 years of fighting, around 1.5 million soldiers and 2 million civilians killed, the US eventually pulled out of Vietnam, finally leaving them to govern themselves. The powerful American empire had lost the war to poorly equipped rebels with guerrilla tactics. Now, obviously, the real story of Vietnam is a lot more complicated than the original trilogy of Star Wars, but it's easy to see the ideas that inspired Lucas. The original trilogy is about a small group of rebels using guerrilla attacks to overcome a large, technologically advanced empire that's trying to control things for their own personal interests instead of letting people govern themselves. It's even easier to see the parallels with the Ewoks in Return of the Jedi. They're indigenous people living in a forest who use wooden traps and knowledge of their surroundings to wreck the Empire's big, expensive war technology. Similarly, the Vietnamese were able to win the war in large part thanks to their use of various booby traps. No matter how you look at it, the heroes of the original trilogy are inspired by leftist radicals standing up to the powerful American Empire. Part 2. The Prequel Trilogy. The original trilogy was definitely political, but a lot of the politics were background elements, so I guess I can sort of understand it if you miss them. Maybe. But if you think that Star Wars shouldn't be political, and you like the prequels, you're just an idiot. No, I'm not really the biggest fan of the prequels. I think they could have used, at the very least, a few more drafts. But that's not really that important here. Even though the writing isn't always stellar, the broad political story of the prequels is really interesting. The trilogy is about Sheev Palpatine, secretly the Sith Lord Darth Sidious, intentionally creating conflicts to gain political power, eventually turning a struggling liberal democracy into a fascist dictatorship. Lucas had already had this general idea when making the original trilogy back in the 70s and 80s. Quote, "That was the period where Nixon was trying to run for a second term, which got me to thinking historically about how do democracies get turned into dictatorships. Because the democracies aren't overthrown, they're given away." This idea was alluded to in the original Star Wars.
In the Imperial Senate...
The Imperial Senate will no longer be of any concern to us. I have just received word that the Emperor has dissolved the Council permanently.
The prequels really expand on this idea. Episodes 2 and 3 were released during the early 2000s, the era of President George W. Bush's War on Terror. Some people noticed parallels between the prequels and the politics of the time. Bush, like Palpatine, was using a crisis to expand his political power through actions like the Patriot Act and the Homeland Security Act. But actually, filming for episodes 1 and 2 were finished well before the 9/11 attacks and the warmongering that followed. So the story of the prequel trilogy wasn't really a commentary on what was currently happening. Instead, it was an unintentional prediction of what was going to happen. When George Lucas was asked about the similarities to real-world events around the time of Episode 3's release, he said, "No matter who you look at in history, the story is always the same. That's what's eerie. It was a little eerie that things have developed the way that they have." That said, some elements in Episode 3 may have been influenced by Bush.
Either you are with us, or you are with the terrorists.
If you're not with me, then you're my enemy.
Only a Sith deals in absolutes.
Though the prequels were less directly linked to a specific real event than the originals, their political themes still deserve a lot of analysis. And there's plenty to analyze, especially with the help of extra material like novels, comics, and the 2008 Clone Wars series. But to keep the video from getting too long, I'll mostly be focusing on Palpatine's rise to power. In Episode 1, Palpatine, who is a senator at the time, organizes a blockade and invasion of his home planet, Naboo. The elected queen, Padme Amidala, goes to the Galactic Senate for help, but thanks to bureaucracy and corruption, the Senate basically does nothing. The people of Naboo are on their own. So Palpatine convinces Padme to call for a vote of no confidence against the leader of the Senate, Chancellor Valorum. The vote passes, Valorum is removed, and Palpatine is elected to replace him as Supreme Chancellor. That's step 1 of his plan, done. In Episode 2, Palpatine plays both sides of a growing galactic conflict. While he leads the Republic, his apprentice Count Dooku has been convincing worlds to join a confederacy of independent systems that are separating from the Republic. Thanks to the crisis that he helped create, Palpatine is given emergency powers by the Senate. These powers extend his term past its constitutional limit, give him direct control over the Jedi Order, and allow him to command the newly created clone army against the Separatists, which he does in the Battle of Geonosis, starting the Clone Wars. Palpatine now has even more power than he did before, and control over both sides of a galactic civil war. Step 2, done. And finally, Episode 3, Palpatine's Endgame. After 3 years of war, he arranges the deaths of the Confederacy's leader, Count Dooku, and the droid army's supreme commander, General Grievous. With the war nearing an end, he gives Order 66, causing the clones to turn against their Jedi generals and kill them. In the Senate, he claims that the Jedi tried to overthrow him and take control of the Republic. With this as an excuse, he announces his plan to reorganize the Republic into the Galactic Empire. His speech is met with thunderous applause from the Senate. Just like George said, democracies aren't overthrown, they're given away. Now, Emperor Palpatine has more power than ever, and his greatest opponents, the Jedi, are pretty much wiped out. Over the course of a decade and a half, he's turned a democratic republic into a fascist dictatorship. Now that we've covered Palpatine, let's talk about the Trade Federation, the company that produces the battle droids that are used in both the invasion of Naboo and the Clone Wars. The Federation isn't some small-scale interstellar shipping company, it's a business conglomerate so powerful that it has its own private military force and a seat on the Galactic Senate. Through the Trade Federation, Lucas shows the influence that the wealthy have on politics. From a 2012 CBS interview with Lucas, "I'm also a very ardent believer in democracy, not capitalist democracy, and I do not believe that the rich should be able to buy the government, and that's just the way I feel." Is that the America you see, where the rich have bought the government? Oh, come on. It's been that way for a long time. The Trade Federation also has a big role in forming the Confederacy. After all, the Clone Wars are good for them, because they put their battle droids in demand and make them money. Here, Lucas shows how the military-industrial complex benefits from war and death. Also, Lucas has never confirmed this, but it's very possible that the name of the Federation's leader, Newt Gunray, comes from Republican politicians Newt Gingrich and Ronald Reagan. Gunray, Reagan, I think you get it. The prequel trilogy is the story of how an ineffective, corrupt democracy can quickly fall to fascism. They're a criticism of neoliberal governments with no care for the people they're actually supposed to represent.
I was not elected to watch my people suffer and die while you discuss this invasion in a committee.
It's a reflection of American government, motivated by corporate interests, completely useless when it comes to helping actual people. Conclusion: the sequel trilogy. Some people seem to hate the sequel trilogy for being too political, but honestly, in my opinion, they're the least political trilogy of the three. I suppose the First Order could serve as a neo-Nazi allegory. They're a new generation of fascists bringing back a fallen ideology, but most of what they have to offer is just the Empire but again. And then most of that is kind of thrown out the window anyways in Episode 9 for weird Sith shit. People only call these movies too political because they have more women and people of color in them, even though half of those characters are treated like shit in the last entry by giving them absolutely no character agency, changing their existing canon backstory to align with racial stereotypes, or just writing them out of the story entirely. Also, two random unnamed gay people kiss each other for literally 1 second. How progressive. There are plenty of interesting themes in the sequels, especially in The Last Jedi, but when it comes to politics, they don't really add anything too new. So no, the sequels aren't too political, you're just an asshole. Thank you so much for watching the video, I hope you enjoyed it. I plan on working pretty hard this summer to hopefully get a bunch of videos out within the next few months. I've got plenty of ideas lined up. I believe my next video is going to be about the handling of Thor and Loki in the MCU, and I've got plenty of other videos coming up about anime, sci-fi, film, comics, and any other nerd shit you can think of. So if any of that sounds interesting to you, please feel free to subscribe.